we talked about the famous meeting of the two groups, the Stone group and the Campbell group, that came together at the old Hill Street meeting house in Lexington. What a great meeting it was. 60-year-old Barton Stone was there, and he and Raccoon John Smith shook hands. They embraced. Tears were flowing throughout the house as the agreement was made that the group that had been associated with Barton W. Stone, known as the Christians, merged with those who were associated with Alexander Campbell, known as the Reformers or the Disciples, and the two came together. At that point, this man, T.M. Allen, who was a great gospel preacher in Kentucky, made many converts, established many congregations, went on into Missouri, continued his work there. He made the suggestion at that time, now that we're merged, let's call ourselves Church of Christ. And we've got all this, some are Christian, some are Church of Christ. But you know, that continued on, and even wasn't probably 30, 40 years ago, there was a congregation I was reading about today that had never used the instrument, but they were called a Christian church, just a hangover from the old days when the names were used interchangeably. Well, some may wonder, well, who gave up? Who really had to give up something? Did the group that associated with Campbell have to give up something? Was it the Stone group that had to relinquish some teachings that they were doing? I think you might find it interesting what John Rogers participated in the writing of the biography of Barton W. Stone when Barton was really about 70 years old, I believe. But here's what John Rogers wrote in answer to that question 12 years later, after the merger took place, 1844. He said, "No one ever thought that the Reformers," that'd be the ones associated with Campbell, so-called, had come over to us, or that we had gone over to them. We found ourselves contending for the same great principles of Christianity, and we resolved to unite our energies, to harmonize the church, to save the world. I entered into it upon principle. I think immense good has grown out of it. That had it never taken place, our cause in Kentucky would be far in the rear of the position it now occupies." So the answer was that neither gave up. They were teaching the same things basically and came together. Well, have you ever wondered about the Christians in the East? You know, the ones that were associated there with Elias Smith and O'Kelly and that group that became known later on as a Christian Connection. Were they involved in the merger of the Campbell and Stone forces? And the answer is no, they weren't. It's rather a strange thing. The year that the merger took place was 1832, and Campbell made an extensive tour into the East, but no mention was made of those Eastern Christians. And then just 4 years later, he took another trip into Vermont, and he saw some of these Christians that were there, and he liked them, he said. He preached for them several times. He talked to their members. He talked to their elders. He described them as being intelligent and candid, willing to be taught the way of the Lord more perfectly, but nothing ever came of it. And we wonder why. There was no union of the New England Christians with those of the Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell groups. In 1845, a man by the name of J.J. Harvey suggested that a union take place between the Campbell Stone forces and the New England Christians. But Campbell rejected it at this time. This is 1845, on the basis that those people were Unitarians. Well, Stone, 1 year previously, had died, but before that, he advocated merging with these people, but nothing ever came of it. So the Christian Connection, as they were called, many of the congregations eventually wound up being taken in by the congregational churches. Now, two of the Christian Connection congregations, the one in Haverhill, Massachusetts, founded in 1803, and also the one in Lynn, Massachusetts, founded about the same time, came over to the Disciples group. So, not all of them, but the majority of congregations founded over a period of about 2 years, found it a fairly easy thing to merge together. At least with a little bit of time, that was accomplished. I want you to notice just a few of the highlights of Barton Stone's life as we conclude talking about him. When he was 24, he was licensed to preach for the Presbyterians. When he was 32, he dissolved the Springfield Presbytery, and the first congregation of the Restoration movement associated with him was established. That was when he was 32 years old. He was 54 when he began publishing the Christian Messenger, published it for several years and did a great deal of good with that paper. He was 62 in 1834 when he moved to Jacksonville, Illinois, and there he found two congregations, one associated with Stone and one associated with Campbell. And he convinced those two congregations to join together, and when they did, he joined forces with them, placed his membership there. He was 63 in 1835 when he published a songbook in conjunction with Walter Scott, Alexander Campbell, and John T. Johnson. In 1836, he was 64 years old when he became seriously ill and hampered his preaching for a while. In 1839, at 67, he lost his hearing, or most of it. In 1841, when he was 69 years old, he suffered a stroke of paralysis and never completely recovered. But he was able to get out of his sick bed and continue to preaching on a limited basis. In 1843, at 71, I said a while ago he was 70 when he wrote his biography or autobiography. He was 71, actually, with the help of John Rogers. In the fall of 1843, accompanied by his son, Barton Jr., and his youngest daughter, he began his last preaching tour, and it took him into Indiana and Ohio and Kentucky and Missouri. Here he saw old friends that he hadn't seen for years and years. He knew that he was dying, or was shortly to die. And these good friends of his that were very dear to him probably knew the same thing. So this was a very big emotional drain for Barton Stone as he made this last trip. He went over to Cane Ridge and tried to preach to them over there. And he read the 20th chapter of Acts, and tears flowed down his cheeks as he read that chapter. It was October the 19th in 1844 that he reached Bear Creek, Missouri, where the brethren there were assembled for a gospel meeting. And he started to preach for them and was just too sick to continue. He went home to rest, not home, but he was put up there for a couple of days, and he thought he was able to go back and preach to them, and then he preached his last sermon to them. Apparently he knew that this was the last time that he was able to speak to them. His strength was almost gone, and he exhorted the sinner to obey. He exhorted the Christians to be faithful, and the audience wept, realizing that this great man would be with them very little longer. T.M. Allen keeps popping up. It was T.M. Allen who gave this record. He was there. He said, his great age, his whitened locks, his feeble frame, his deep and ardent piety, his pure morality and unblemished character all conspired to make this last sermon solemn. So a lot of tears were shed as he preached to his good friends for the last time. Barton spent the day there with his son Barton, and then he left to head home for Illinois. He was in a very weakened condition, and he never was able to reach his home alive. He got as far as Hannibal, Missouri, where his daughter lived, daughter Amanda and her husband S.S. Bowen. And there they put Barton Stone to bed, being very ill. The following information I find very interesting. This man right here was a good friend of his, Jacob Creeth Jr. And Jacob Creeth was with Barton Stone not the moment that he died, but close to that time. And he sent in his account of what he knew about the death of Barton Stone, and it was published in, I believe it was the December issue, 1844 of the Millennial Harbinger, Campbell's paper. This is the information that he sent in on Thursday, September the 7th. Stone had called for Creeth to come and be with him. Creeth was sick himself and was unable to go that day, but 2 days later, on November the 9th, he was able to go visit his friend Barton Stone. He said that they prayed together and they sang a song together. Creeth, of course, knew that his friend was dying. Creeth asked Stone if he had any fear of death, and Stone replied, "Oh no, Brother Creeth, I know whom I have believed and in whom I have trusted, and I'm persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed to him. I know that my Redeemer lives. All of my dependence is on God and his Son, Jesus Christ." Stone then quoted some scriptures and he commented on them. And then he turned to his family and exhorted his family to be faithful. At this point, Jacob Creeth had to leave, his good friend. And as he walked out the door, Stone said to him, "God bless you, my brother. I hope to meet you in heaven." Stone was put in his chair. His physician, Dr. D.T. Morton, said to him or asked him, "Father Stone, you have been much persecuted for the peculiarity of your teachings. Are you willing to die in the faith that you have so long taught to others?" What a question to ask a man. Are you willing to die holding to that faith that you taught to others? Stone replied with these words, "I am. During my long life, I have made some errors on minor points, but in the main, I conscientiously believe that I've taught the truth and have tried to live what I have preached to others." They then sang a song that was a favorite one of his and his good friend, J.T. Johnson. Here are 4 lines from that song. "Farewell, vain world, I'm going home. My Savior smiles and bids me come. Bright angels beckon me away to sing God's praise in endless days." He called for his clay pipe. Some are shocked to think of a preacher smoking. These were olden days, remember. He called for his clay pipe and smoked it. He was alert to the very end, and he wanted to talk about the love of God. His son Barton came and sat down by him, and Barton put his head on his son's shoulder and passed away without a struggle. He was 72 years old. That was November the 9th, 1844. The day that Creeth came to see him was the day that he died. Well, the next day, they took his remains and carried them by wagon to a locust grove in Hannibal, Missouri, where he was buried. In 1846, now that was in 1844, in 1846, they removed his remains and took them to his home in Jacksonville, Illinois, where they were buried. He was buried 7 miles outside of town. Then it was in 1847 that his remains were removed from Illinois and brought down to the old Cane Ridge Meeting House. This is the sepulcher that is over his grave now. And he's buried just, maybe 150 yards from the old Cane Ridge Meeting House, right on the grounds. And this is what the stone says. You can't see it from there, I know. It says this: "The Church of Christ at Cane Ridge and other generous friends in Kentucky have caused this monument to be erected in a tribute of affection and gratitude to Barton W. Stone, minister of the gospel of Christ and the distinguished reformer of the 19th century." Now, the old Cane Ridge Meeting House stands today with a superstructure over it, and you're going to see that in the picture. It was made of ash logs. It's 50 feet long, 30 feet wide, 15 feet high. It originally had a dirt floor, and then the next time it had a floor made from cut logs, and another floor, I think, was put in after that. You're going to see the rest of it in what I'm going to show you, so I won't comment any further on the construction of the cabin. It's not generally known that Barton Stone was quite a good poet. He wrote a number of poems and a number of hymns. Remember, we talked about Eliza, his first wife, how much he loved her, and he wrote a 19-stanza elegy in memory of his beloved first wife. Let me give you just a few lines of that. I think it tells us a little bit about the man. "But mortal tongues can't speak the songs to saints immortal this belongs. I'll now forsake those shining throngs and leave my dear Eliza. A mansion too for me is there. Soon with Eliza I'll appear, and with her in the banquet share, and part no more forever. Come, brothers, sisters, children dear, dry your sorrows, banish care, and seek with me to where Eliza now is feasting. To Canaan's happy land I go, where streams of pleasure ever flow. Soon shall I quit this vale of woe, and dwell in bliss forever." Stone's wife and infant child were buried side by side, and over the grave was a willow tree. And there was another long poem about the willow tree and the grave of his wife and his child, just about 6 lines of that. "Beneath this grassy turf lies innocence and love. The willow bends its flexible boughs above, nor is her son, deep sleeping by her side, forgotten by the mourner, far spread wide. It waves its boughs o'er his infantile head, and sweeps the tomb and murmurs for the dead." Okay, I think we're ready to see the picture All I need to do now is to push power.
Get the video in the back.
I push power. Is anything happening yet? Oh. This is a three-man job, you can tell. May I warn you ahead, this is not a professional taking these pictures. This is a new camera that I bought to take back there, so sometimes I zoom in a little fast. I might comment along with it. This is just a very small little farm road that's on the house, two-lane road, and as you drive along the road, that's the marker that you'll see that indicates the Cambridge Meeting House. Okay, well, let's go inside and take a look and see what it looks like.
This is our first view of the Cambridge Meeting House with the new superstructure built around it. We'll go up inside and take a look. These are just gorgeous. The disciples of Christ operate the Cambridge meeting place now, unfortunately. They can keep it up there nicely. The whole area is just beautiful. And I can hardly wait to get inside. Okay, this is the front of the old meeting house. As you can see, the superstructure is built around it, but they've maintained the old cabin itself. Here's the podium with Barton Stone's picture in the back. In front of it, the table where the Lord's Supper was served. This is the view from the podium. You see some pews are facing toward the podium and some are sideways. And we see stairs going up into the balcony. Originally, there were no stairs going up into the balcony. The balcony area was reserved for slaves, and they had to come through a ladder going up through a window to get into that area. That's the entrance where we came in, and to the left of the entrance to our right are more pews. And on the left side there's another entrance with pews. This is to the left of the pulpit area.
My battery's getting low right there. There's a Bible here on the pulpit that was made in 1836. It says it has no connection with Cambridge, but it was donated by some people that he placed here. And this is the pulpit area where Brother Glenn and many other men in the church preached. Although the building now is taken over by the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, it originally was not. There was no instrument as you see here originally. That was probably much later. But these old logs originally didn't have any chinking between the logs, so that it was not a very warm place. There was no heating, of course, no cooling. So it's all right for them at the time, but I wouldn't probably stand for today. The painting of Barton W. Stone is probably the most familiar of the paintings of Stone. Okay, now we're going to go up the stairway and see the galley above the auditorium.
No windows and no.
Yeah, that's right.
I can pretend that I meant to do that, but I left my camera on. Get a good look at the floor.
did that once. I've done that.
Okay.
I got a lot of tears.
Introduce yourself again.
I'm Franklin McGuire, I'm curator at King Ridge.
Okay, appreciate that. Tell us just what you just said about the original location of the pulpit being, well, where it is now.
Well, the pulpit as it is now is as it was originally, but until 1932 it was placed at the east end of the meeting house.
Mhm.
These seats were new in 1882, and they were in two sections facing the pulpit with the center aisle running from the west door. So the pulpit and the first pump organ was down there, and the communion table was all at that east end during those 50 years.
And did you say the original, that is the original wood?
Most of the wood in the pulpit is the original.
It's interesting.
Stored and saved.
Now these logs that are there now, they go back to the original?
Oh yes, this building has never been moved or taken down. The structure is all the original. This is the third floor, the first of which was a puncheon or split log floor. This floor has been down since 1882. We don't know how many roofs the building has had, but otherwise the building is all the original.
That's amazing. Now, this window area where the slaves had to enter, there was a ladder placed up against the building here, and then they went through there. Actually, it's a window, but it went down to the floor level of the galley. So it was a window, but it really wasn't a window. It was an entrance, only available with a ladder, however. I appreciate it. When did this pump organ come into the building?
That particular one specifically was
Well,
brought in here about 30 years ago. The original one, which was almost identical to that, was brought in here and was placed in here in 1882.
Was it being used as a church building for worship in 1882?
Oh, yes.
Until what year?
It's never ceased being used as a church building. It's never been anything else, and has always been used.
On a regular basis, I mean, for a regular congregation.
1921 is when the last congregation decided to discontinue. But with that, it's become busier all the time.
Well, this is the type of bench that was used in the meeting house from 1791 to 1829. It was made from split logs. From 1829 to about 1881, this is the type of bench was used, and this is one of the original ones that, the only one remaining, that came out of the 1829 building. Okay, this commemorates the meeting with Rackham John Smith and Barton W. Stone at Lexington. And this commemorates the printing of the Christian Messenger, which was Barton W. Stone's paper. These are part of the superstructure in the glass. This commemorates the baptism of Barton W. Stone in Stone Creek, Paris, Kentucky. It was 1807. And this medallion commemorates the Cane Ridge Revival, 1801. This is Barton W. Stone preaching to people from a stump. An estimated 20 to 30,000 people were present for that Cane Ridge Revival. This medallion commemorates the place where the unity meeting took place between the Campbell people and the Barton W. Stone people. This is the Hill Street Church. Unfortunately, about 20 years ago, it was destroyed. Today it's a bank parking lot. John T. Johnson on a preaching tour with Barton W. Stone is the event that this commemorates. Of course, there's no glass in the windows, but I thought that door was interesting. I suppose originally they closed that when there was bad weather or fear of an Indian attack. the ceiling between the logs, which wasn't there originally, of course it's here now, but originally, they left the chinking out so that they could see anytime there were danger from an Indian attack. No windows at all in the building except the areas above the doorway, which served as the slave entrance. Okay, now this is the burial place of Bart Livingstone. And you see it's quite a monument to him. The monument says, Janice, read that for us, please.
The Church of Christ at Cane Ridge and other generous friends in Kentucky have caused this monument to be erected as a tribute of affection and gratitude to Bart Livingstone, minister of the gospel of Christ and the distinguished reformer of the 19th century, born December the 24th, 1772, died November the 9th, 1844. His remains lie here.
Interesting that it starts off, the Church of Christ.
And this is his wife.
Okay. This is the burial place of Eliza. This was his first wife. What does it say?
Here lies Eliza, daughter of William and Tabitha Campbell, wife of Elder B.W. Stone. She was born in 1784, married July 2nd, 1801, and died May 30th, 1810. Dedicated as a memorial to the deceased by C.C. Moore and Mary, his wife. Mary Stone Moore was the third daughter of Eliza and Barton W. Stone. The remains of Eliza C. Stone and this ledger marker were removed to Cane Ridge from the farm cemetery in the 1930s. Eliza was not related to Thomas and Alexander Campbell.
Out behind the stone grave, you'll see a small graveyard there, but we understand these are not relatives of B.W. Stone. Very peaceful place. This is the museum, so we're going to go in and see some interesting things about Cane Ridge. This is just below the Cane Ridge Meeting House. And the first thing you see is a portrait of Barton W. Stone and the last will and testimony of the Springfield Presbytery. Very important document that separated him from denominationalism and set him on the road along with others to proclamation of New Testament Christianity and a restoration of the New Testament Church. This is a picture of the old Cane Ridge Meeting House as it was before the superstructure was built around it to protect it. From 1791 until sometime in the 1950s, it stood exposed to the elements. This is a letter that Barton Stone wrote to John Mulkey. John Mulkey was preaching the gospel in 1804 in Kentucky. And the little meeting house that is shown there was built in 1804. The letter is requesting that John come for a meeting at Cane Ridge. These are some pictures of some of the restoration leaders that aren't commonly pictured as much as Stone, Campbell, and Walter Scott. These are all key men in restoration. Here's a list of the members of the Church of Christ at Cane Ridge in 1838. This old rostrum was used in the meeting house from this communion set was used in the building from 1889 to years following. Very beautiful set. Pretty the peaceful place is Stoner Creek. This is for Barton Stone, and those that worship with him were baptized in 1807, Stoner Creek.
That's all I'm going to show you tonight. That Stoner Creek, though, is very significant because not only was Martin Stone baptized there, but the Cambridge congregation, when they came to the conclusion that baptism was immersion in water, they went out to the creek and they baptized each other. So that's very significant. I hope that wasn't too poorly done to give you some idea of what it's like. I look forward to the excitement to going to that place for so long. Have you been there, Donnie? No. Has anyone else been there to the Cambridge Meeting House? It's really a good little trip. Janice and I just thoroughly enjoyed it. And there are so many restoration sites around there. It's just amazing. I hope one of these days, before we shuffle off this mortal coil, to get up to Bethany and see the place where Alexander Campbell lived in the school there in the graveyard. Haven't done that yet. Has anyone done that? Well, all right. We have just about 6 or 7 minutes. May I get started on Thomas Campbell, or do you want to wait till next time and start with Thomas fresh? All right, since you want it now, we're going to give it to you now. Thomas Campbell, when you list the men who were the chief proponents of the Restoration, you have to list Thomas Campbell. There's Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell, Walter Scott. Those three, if you're listing the top three, just have to be there. The top two, the fourth one obviously is the one we've been talking about, Barton W. Stone. Aside from him, the other three would be Thomas, Alexander Campbell, and Walter Scott. So those four really make up the four-prong attack that really meant so much to us in the Restoration period. But Thomas Campbell, where he perhaps was behind chronologically in preaching the Restoration, behind in the sense of Barton Stone was before him, he is recognized as the architect of the Restoration movement. From Thomas Campbell came some of the clearest thinking that came out of the Restoration movement. The declaration and address that he wrote is one of the most important pieces of Restoration literature that we have. He was highly educated, not only for the ministry, but in secular activities as well. He was described as a man of culture and a man of great learning. He had a strong mind, a good heart. He was a very sincere, devout, dedicated man that believed in trying to please God. He lived his life and taught his children to live their lives in order to please God. He was born in Ireland, County Down, Ireland, in 1763. As a young man, he set out to be a teacher, but in those days, if you had some experience that was out of the ordinary, you perhaps would think that God was calling you to preach the gospel. And so some experience occurred to Thomas Campbell, and he felt that this was his calling to be a minister instead of a secular teacher. He belonged to the anti-burger group of the Seceder Presbyterian Church. Through the help of a man named John Kinley, he was able to go to school in Scotland, the University of Glasgow, for 3 years. He finished the prescribed courses and then went on to an anti-burger school. We call it a School of Divinity, where he studied, received his degree there, and a license to preach for the Presbyterian Church. Thomas began preaching in Antwerp, Ireland. He met and married a French Huguenot girl named Jane Cornegal, and she was a member of the church, or attended where Thomas preached, and he met her there and married her. And they lived many, many happy years together, not only in Ireland, but in this country as well. Thomas preached in several places, but in 1798 he moved to Rich Hill, Ireland, and that's where Alexander Campbell spent his youth. Thomas started a school there to supplement his income and continued to teach that school, I believe it was, for about 9 years until he went to America. His ministerial duties included visiting the membership twice a year to examine them about their Bible knowledge. And I thought, what a unique thing. How would you like the preacher to come to your house twice a year and to test you on your Bible knowledge? It might cause us to study a little bit more. Good idea. Very early in Alexander's life, he was filled with all kinds of literature. His father was a man who was well-rounded in his education, and he was determined that young Alexander would be exposed to these things. It was the rule in Campbell's house that each child would memorize a verse of Scripture during the day, and then each evening they would have a family devotional period where that verse of Scripture would be repeated. And so you would be inclined to memorize a lot of verses. Alexander Campbell memorized large portions of the Bible. Almost daily the boy studied the Bible along with Brown's Catechism. He memorized rich passages in Greek and French and English literature. Thomas Campbell had a high regard for the Bible. One thing that impressed Alexander in later life, he told about it. When he would go into his father's study, his father would be there preparing for a lesson or studying the Bible. And what he had on the table before him was the Bible and a concordance. And his shelf was filled with religious books. But he was relying more and more on the Bible and less on the books that were written about religion by men. So gradually his father was turning more and more to the Bible and less toward the writings of men for his religious consumption. I mentioned that Thomas was a member of the particular division of the Presbyterian Church, and it's kind of an odd assortment of names. He was an Old Light, Anti-Burger, Seceder Presbyterian. Now, if you wonder what that means, I'll just tell you. In 1690, the Presbyterian Church had established itself as the state church of Scotland with the Westminster Confession of Faith that we've heard so much about through Barton Stone's life. After 1707, there were two divisions within the Presbyterian Church, or the Church of Scotland, the moderates and the evangelicals. The evangelicals in 1731, led by Ebenezer Erskine, strongly objected to the method of making assignments to preach. And this infuriated the authorities within the church to the point that they just threw him out of the ministry. Well, he took a group and they formed the Seceder Presbyterian Church, 1732. The Seceders grew, and by 1800 there were more than 200 congregations in Scotland. In 1789, the Seceders divided into the burghers and the anti-burghers, not the McDonald burgers, just the anti-burghers on the question of oaths. The burgesses of a local community would require you to take an oath that you would support the religion of that community. Now, if you wouldn't do that, you were an anti-burgher. If you would, you were a burgher. So he was an anti-burgher. That's Thomas. Anti-burgher Thomas. In 1799, both branches of the Seceder Church divided again into New Lights and Old Lights on the question of whether or not the Solemn League and Covenant should be made a term of communion. Well, Thomas was an Old Light. Now let's put it together. He was an Old Light, anti-burgher, Seceder Presbyterian. Now, if you had to fill that out on a hospital form, you'd have to have a second line. Amidst all of this religious division, Thomas Campbell worked for unity and even appeared before the synod of the country, trying to bring these two burgher groups together, but to no avail. After he had left the country in 1820, they did unite. Thomas, though, sought to bring himself and his family closer to God. Money was not a primary consideration. He was offered a job by the Governor General of Ireland to be the tutor of his children, and he turned it down because he thought this would place his family in a position where worldliness would perhaps influence him. As a preacher, he worked hard, and before long, his health began to suffer, and the doctor recommended that he leave and get away from this work and perhaps this area. And it was then that he began to think about taking a trip and living in America. Several families around Rich Hill had already moved to America. Alexander Campbell, even as a teenager, says, "Dad, when I'm old enough, I'm going to move to America." So it seemed to be the natural thing. He'd been preaching and operating the Rich Hill School for 9 years, had a combined income of $250 per year, so he wasn't leaving a terribly lucrative work, but it was steady, and he was able to feed his family. The family was to stay behind until he got to America, got settled in, and sent for them. In 1807, Campbell left Ireland for America on the ship Brutus. Now, if you were leaving, you would write your children and your wife a note, be sure and feed the chickens and slop the hogs and pick the corn. Here's what he says. This is a spiritual man. He writes this note to his family. Live to God. Be devoted to him in heart and in all your undertakings. Be sincere. Imbibe the doctrine. Obey the precepts. Copy the example and believe the promise of the gospel. Just to put this in context, this is 1807. Barton W. Stone has already left the Presbyterian Church. He's already written the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery. He's already had the confrontation with the Shakers. He has already been immersed. He's already established many congregations of the New Testament church. Thomas is 45 years old at the time when he leaves. He lives to be 1 month shy of 91, so he spent half his life in Ireland and half his life in America. And with that, I think I'm going to close for now. We'll take up the life of Thomas Campbell, very interesting man, very important in the Restoration movement. So I apologize for going over a couple minutes. Thank you for your attention.